welcome from San Diego with a bit of a down under accent, Rodger Savory.
Thank you for, well, I guess I'm meant to be waking up. Thank you for inviting me. Snooze. Okay, are we up? I'm trying to put my timer on so that I don't, yeah, that's what I'm worried about. Okay, so anyway, this I think is probably the most important slide of my presentation. I'll leave it up there for a while. Does everyone understand the importance of that? So let me explain the difference between sand and soil. Sand is just the elements. It's just the silica, granite, whatever, etc., etc. And it doesn't become soil until life is added. Now, for over 10,000 years, about 10,500 years, we've had the plow, we've plowed up land, and we've known that land was fertile for a period and then it became infertile. We didn't know why it became infertile. We didn't understand that, for example, a single tablespoon of soil had more microorganisms in it than there are humans on the planet. Let that sink in. There were more life forms in a single teaspoon or tablespoon of soil than there were humans on the planet. So what we thought of as dirt, we now know is a living organism, and it's a global living organism. So thanks to DNA technology and electron microscopes, we've been able to look and see just how much there is. Now, if soil is what all above ground life is depending on, and soil by definition being this living life form, we have to ask the question, what does all soil need to live? And basically all living organisms in the soil will be sterilized and killed by ultraviolet light, or it will be burnt by the heat of the sun. So the number one consideration with having a healthy, fertile soil is to keep soils covered and protected 100% of the time to protect them from the destructive forces of the sun. But those same destructive forces of the sun are also the same source of energy for all life living under the ground. And we now know that it is the photosynthetic process that pumps C3 and C4 carbons under the ground to be utilized by all those billions and trillions of life forms under the ground that are protected from the sun. So the first thing we need to understand is by looking after those microorganisms, they then feed the next stage of life, which is bigger, and they feed the next stage, and it keeps on going up. And the biggest things we have up on top of the ground right now are the elephants, but it all starts with having a healthy soil and looking after those microorganisms in the soil. Now, within holistic management, which is what I practice and have worked with for about 30 years, we had what we called the 4 missing keys. These were 4 bits of knowledge that have evaded mankind for over 10,500 years that we know about. And without these key insights, without these key pieces of knowledge, we had no hope of solving the problems. So what are these 4 missing keys? Yeah. We needed to understand that the world functions in wholes and in patterns. And that came to us from Jan Smuts in his book Holism and Evolution, written in 1926. My father's discovery was the difference between brittle and non-brittle environments. And these are environments where there's a wet season and a dry season, that's a brittle environment, or an environment where there's atmospheric moisture year-round. And understanding the importance of those. And then understanding the importance of herding animals in brittle environments. A brittle environment where there's a 9-month or a 6-month or a 3-month dry season, the only thing that could cycle carbon in that dry season, the only microorganisms were found where it's warm, wet, and dark. which just happens to be in the intestines of grazing animals. So around the world, wherever we had brittle environments, we also had the big herds of bison in this continent, steppes, saiga in Russia, the wildebeest and buffalo in Africa. So all over the world where there was a brittle environment, we had the vast herds cycling the carbon annually. And then the fourth missing key, which was kind of important because we didn't understand it, was the role of pack hunting animals on the behavior. The key word in that sentence is behavior. When cattle walk around without any fear of predators, they put their hooves down flat and they don't disturb the soil surface. When they're agitated, nervous, and worried about protecting their calves or fawns, their hoof behavior changes, and that going up onto their tippy toes, they get the seeds that have fallen in the fall under the soil where they can germinate and grow. Also, before they go running off, they lighten the load, which means they deposit all the dung and urine, which is the fertilizer for the newly germinating seeds. So, and this fertilizer or urine was very important for the fungi, and we're now realizing more and more that fungi are a vital part of the three parts of life. So that was important to understand. Sorry, it went too fast. This is one of the key bits of what I would say false knowledge in range science around the world. We've known since a French scientist showed us in the 1950s that overgrazing is a factor of time, not of numbers or species. So it doesn't matter whether it's donkey, goat, cow, chicken, whatever. And it doesn't matter how many you have, it's how long they're on a piece of land. So all our BLM regulations shouldn't be telling us how many cows we can run on the range. They should be telling us how much time the herd can be in any one location, because that is the mathematical bottom line. The next thing is this is absolutely not understood, and this is the fact that over-rest is a factor of time plus, this is driving me nuts, plus, where do I have to point it? That. Plus lack of animal numbers and animal density. Now, that's very important. That little grass plant that my penknife is pointing at is what we call a over-rest tolerant grass. They only grow about that tall, so that the sunlight can always penetrate the growth points. And that over-rest tolerant grass plant, 70 years later, is now dying of over-rest. So when we rest the land, it has the exact opposite effect that we thought it would have. Then the lichens come in, and ultimately everything dies. Come on. Positives and negatives of grass fire. We know of one positive. It removes old dead leaves to expose the growth points, preventing death from over-rest. However, it has rather a lot of negatives. I'll just flash through them. That's, to me, probably the most important one right there. And that comes from the University of Namibia, their data. That one's kind of an important one, which was made in a talk yesterday. Kills all animals and birds and all biodiversity. And then the final one is it burns your potential profits. So there's not many reasons for us to use fire, other than an old belief system that was basically flawed. So when we come back and we look at the holes and how they function in these brittle environments, what we're finding is that when we run cattle at about 1 million pounds per acre, or where I'm from, 1 million kgs per hectare, what we find is that the whole ecosystem starts functioning again, because the density of dung and urine is enough for the fungi, it's enough for the bacteria, it's enough for the grass plants. We're finding these connections that we didn't know about before. For example, a single fungi will have a symbiotic relationship with each individual grass plant, and it'll bring nutrients 11 feet back to that grass. Well, if there's no urine falling within an 11-foot radius of that grass plant doesn't get to benefit. You probably have all seen the patches in your pastures where you have the dark green growth. Well, that was as a result of fungi trading nutrients for sugars with these grass plants. And we didn't start seeing these results until we started trying to mimic nature. And this is vital in the brittle environments, to cycle that carbon, get it all into those intestines, and where the bacteria can break everything down. When we're managing holistically to try and get the effects we want, what makes holistic management different to all the management systems that we've got around the world is a difference between linear decision-making and holistic decision-making. Now, we as a human are incapable of making holistic decisions. It's why we've turned 2/3 of the planet into a desert. And so knowing this, we've come up with a model that forces us to make a decision, but at the same time we make it, think about social, economic, and environmental impacts simultaneously. And this helps us to think a bit more clearly. So when we're managing holistically, we start by creating a context. And this is where we decide how do we want our lives to be. And this is different for everybody. But without it, we have no hope. Without it, we have unintended consequences of our decisions. Without it, we destroy the forest because we needed money for the school fees, without realizing that, well, what are our grandchildren going to do? Without it, we don't harvest the forest and we destroy our economy. We really need to think about how do we want our lives to be. And then once we know how our lives to be, what has to be produced to live such lives? And that is absolutely important. We've got to produce something to have the quality of life. We've got to utilize our resources. And then the next part is a description of their resource base as it would have to be to enable people hundreds of years into the future to be living such lives. I personally like hunting. I would love it if my grandchildren could go hunting. But if we kill all the animals and leave nothing for our grandchildren to go hunting, how do they get to live the lives that we enjoyed? So we have to make decisions today for the future. And unfortunately, we're so busy living life that we very seldom do that, and government policies very seldom do that. So this is, when you cut down a tree, okay, if my grandchildren are going to cut down a tree, maybe I should plant 10 trees to replace the one I just cut down. When we harvest a couple of million bison, well, maybe we shouldn't harvest all the bison because we actually all like bison hunting. So let's leave a few. These are historical examples that I'm giving that show that one decision at a time, without thinking of the context, we've destroyed the planet. And so we really need to think about the impacts our decisions today are having. When we decide to plow a field and we kill all the soil microorganisms, well, what are we going to leave our grandchildren if we leave a sterile field with no life in the soil anymore? We have to think about the consequences of our decisions. But then the context cannot contain any decision already made, so you can't say, well, I'm going to be a cattleman. And it can have no prejudice against any future action or tool. Well, there's no, over my dead body are we ever going to have goats on this property. So because whatever tool we might need to solve a problem in the future, we mustn't remove it from ourselves. And then nothing can be quantified or prioritized. One of the famous people in the holistic management movement is a guy by the name of Joel Salatin. And Joel, many years ago, in his context, he said he wanted to earn $65,000 a year. At that time, he was earning about $12,000. Well, Joel now has a business, brings in over $2 million a year, but Joel only makes $65,000 a year because that's what he put in writing, and it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it would be wiser to say I want to have enough wealth or enough profit to live the quality of life I want to lead, not quantify it. Or don't specify I want to have 1,000 chickens or 1 million trees in my nursery. Don't specify it. Just describe the general process. And when we find we do that, we start just seeing things turn around. So all objectives, all goals, all visions and missions can then be assessed within the holistic context using 7 filtering questions. And we do this to ensure that decisions are socially, economically, and environmentally sound, both short and long term. And we have a feedback loop where we presume we are incorrect. Hands up, men. Who has ever made a decision that was wrong? Oh, you liars, your ego wouldn't allow you to say that. But particularly men, we have a real struggle, admitting that we were wrong, and so we presume that we're incorrect as soon as we make this correct decision. We presume that we're incorrect, and we look for the earliest warning signs that we were, in fact, incorrect with our decision, so we can modify our decision as soon as possible. Now, think about how important that would be when we create laws and policy in this country. That is probably the greatest flaw in our current law-creating mechanism, is that we don't have a feedback loop to correct the law as soon as we identify where it was wrong. We monitor for the earliest indicators, as I said, and then we can replan. And we do that to minimize unintended consequences, and you can all think of these. I mean, the rangelands, the forests, the timber, the pine beetle. You can name any one of the problems that we've heard talked about at this conference, and you would realize that they're nearly all a result of an unintended consequence of a policy decision that was made. Okay, so what are the 7 questions? Cause and effect. The second one, weak link. And this is kind of important because there's only ever one weak link, but we break it down into the social weak link, the biological weak link, and the financial weak link. Notice the financial one. Does this action strengthen the weakest link in the chain of production? And that chain of production is from solar energy through to product produced to product sold. Marginal reaction, greatest return towards quality of life. Not towards profit or anything, towards the kind of life we said we wanted to live. Gross profit analysis. Which enterprise goes the most towards covering the overhead of the business? Energy, money, source and use. Will it take you towards your quality of life goals? Sustainability. Towards or away from future resource base described in your holistic context. In other words, if you chop all the trees down and there's nothing for your grandchildren, is that sustainable? No. But all the first 6 questions you can ask in any order as you're trying to solve a problem. The only one we always do last is the society and culture one. And that's the only one that's a feeling. Does it make you feel good in the gut or make you feel rotten? If it makes you feel rotten, it's not the right time to make that decision, and you just delay it. Now, this is very hard. I know I've really struggled for it. Some of the decisions I've had to make, we've waited 14 years until the society and culture were ready to accept this new decision. And when you're chomping at the bit and you want to go forward, but your neighbors aren't ready for it, sometimes you just have to wait. Will it lead to the quality of life you desire? But the final bit is the really important bit. Will it adversely affect the lives of others? And if you think about all the rights and everything of people, that's an important one. Now, I want to talk briefly about instinctual fear, why it's important and dangerous. Humans are a risk-averse species. We all are, and this shows up as fear. Fear of the unknown is a healthy instinct to have. It's what keeps us from playing with the poisonous snake, eating the poisonous mushroom, etc., etc. This fear of the unknown is what has kept us alive for millennia. Should we travel over to the next valley, or is that tribe of people cannibals? Will they eat us? Fear of the unknown. So, obviously I'm from Africa where that actually applies. But this fear is what has preventing us from regenerating 2/3 of the planet. And it's the same fear of the unknown which, while it's made us the most successful species on the planet, it's the same instinctual fear that is also going to be the cause of our demise. And I say this because we know from the work we've been doing, we've turned 40 million acres around the world from basically desertified, dead land, back into healthy, productive land. We've fixed economies. We've completely changed lives. So we've got enough real-world examples of managing holistically working. But to get it to go mainstream, we've got to overcome all our instinctual fears. We've got to overcome fear of being ridiculed, fear of what the neighbors think, fear of success, fear of failure, fear of, there's so many fears. And for fear to be overcome, it only gets overcome when enough people have changed. But to get that groundswell beyond the 5% pioneer personalities, that is what is really important. And we've got to produce more food in the next 50 years than all of recorded history combined. Well, how do we get enough farmers to change how they're doing things fast enough when all those farmers have to overcome a lifetime of instinctual fear? So this is, I believe, it's my greatest concern, is trying to figure out how to help people overcome fear. So why should we overcome? Well, the results of managing holistically, socially. Where I come from in Zimbabwe, I don't know if you remember, we had a dictator. He's recently been disposed. We had war veterans, incredible distrust, but it was only through using those 7 questions and that context that our property was the only property in Matabele land to not get confiscated and taken from us. And I used to go to meetings where I would arrive with my rifle, the war veteran would arrive with his AK-47. We'd put our guns down at the door to a meeting on the count of 3, and we'd put our guns, and then we'd go in for a meeting and describe how we wanted our lives to be. Well, neither one of us wanted to be living in fear. Neither one of us wanted to potentially lose our property. And over a period of time, just describing the quality of life we wanted, we realized we all wanted the same thing. Well, 6 or so years later, I was back in Zimbabwe and with my wife and children, and I was in Victoria Falls, and Mandevu, the head war veteran, big old white beard, saw me in town, and he just came running over to me, bear hugged me, picked me off my feet. He was a huge guy. And I just went, oh my God, this all started with us putting our guns down to go into meetings. But it was only when we described the quality of life that we wanted that we were able to get over extreme diverse points of view and extreme conflict and extreme memory. I was nearly killed as a 3-year-old child, nearly stoned to death. So I had my issues with black guys. He had his issues. His family had been killed in the war. Extreme anger, hate, and animosity. But when we described how we wanted our lives to be, we realized we were all actually wanting the same thing. So this process helps with that. Economically, most ranchers don't want us sharing their data, but a study that was done by a professor in Seattle, she surveyed 7,800 holistic managers. 98% of them reported that they were 300% more profitable than their neighbors. I know I've had a single client clear a $900,000 overdraft in 1 year when they hadn't been able to clear it in 13 years. So the economic process we use in managing holistically, where we show people how to actually attain a profit, has been hugely successful. And environmental, we've turned deserts to grasslands. We've got rivers flowing again that haven't flowed in 50 years. We've had vast increases in wildlife. The Africa Center for Holistic Management, where I worked for several years, it was 5,000 acres that was overgrazed with 100 head of cattle. Today, it carries over 600 cattle, 400 goats, 2,000 wild Cape buffalo, and over 500 elephants. God knows how many kudu, sable, impala, everything. And we did that by starting by borrowing 60 head of cattle from the community in the first year to start fixing the land. Then we went up to 360, then we went up to 600. And so this process of testing decisions and understanding how wholes function and just making decisions to build life from the soil up has had fantastic results. A couple of photos. A lot of people believe in the Bible, and if you read the Bible, it talks about the land of milk and honey. Well, just think about it. What would you need to produce milk and honey in Israel? Would you need paddocks that look like that? Do we have the flowers there for honey production? Do we have the rich? So to me, that is what a pasture should look like, and that's what the Bible was trying to tell us that Israel used to look like. So how did we go from that to a desert where Arabs and Jews are throwing rocks at each other? We did it one decision at a time. In the Bible, it talks about Mur, and it talks about the city of Mur being created, and they created the north, south, east, and west paddock. From that point forward in the Bible, every reference to cattle is negative. Every reference to cattle prior to the creation of Mur and the 4 paddocks, where they were still migratory, every reference to cattle was good. The 12 families of Israel, 60,000 head of cattle, 120,000 goats, 40,000 head of cattle, 80,000 sheep and goats. They had massive herds and they migrated. As soon as we settled down, we didn't understand the soils, and we didn't understand rest and recovery, and we didn't understand the changing of the animal's behavior. And we created a desert. So in the Bible, where it talks about the world will change, I believe the world will change when we get this knowledge out globally. And this is a final picture. So this is work I did. The tree is the same in each image. The top image, I made 600 cattle sleep there for a week, and that's all I did. But that gave us an inch of dung and urine to protect the soil surface from ultraviolet light, and the urine to feed the soil fungus and the soil bacteria. The next year was the worst drought in 30 years, and the next year was the worst drought in 50 years. And that image is 10 years later. Look how we've gone from red soil to black soil, full of carbon, full of life, in 1 decade. Now that stream is 300 yards from that location. When I was a child, I used to walk down that bare riverbed hunting impala. And I used to literally leopard crawl about 300 yards out of that stream to get close enough to take a shot at an impala, because it was solid, bare, red soil as far as the eye could see. And that was the only way, when I was 12 years old, I could shoot an impala on that ranch. Well, today I'd bump into the damn things 2 yards away from me. So that's an example of managing holistically, one decision at a time, changing, understanding these ecosystem functions, and turning deserts back into grasslands. It didn't cost us anything. That was just one decision at a time. So I'd encourage all of you to learn about managing holistically, and I'd encourage all of you to think about what future we want for our grandchildren. Thank you.
So Rodger, that fantastic 80,000 foot view, I'd like to bring you down to about 20,000 for a moment. Because you're really, in your presentation, you're talking to the land managers about changing your practices to create what that picture shows us. It seems to me today, and as I fly on airplanes, I don't sit by anybody anymore that doesn't have some level of guilt about eating beef, and it's because we've allowed some non-governmental organizations to hijack some false numbers from the United Nations to plant the seed that the cow is part of the problem, and you clearly walked us through the solution that the cow is the solution. So from a public perception standpoint, which leads to policy, and protesters who apparently are going to show up here today, how do we get the message that the cow is the solution, not the problem? Or a ruminant animal, I should say, a ruminant animal.
Well, let me start by saying when I was in college, I went to UNM and I studied desert field biology when I was there. There were, as someone said yesterday in the talks, there was the bumper sticker, cattle free by 93. So I created one that said cattle galore by 94.
And why don't you have those here for us? Only women make 24.
No, you know, it's very difficult. I'll give you an example of instinctual fear. Leonardo DiCaprio, he did a movie called Blood Diamond, and in it, he learnt his Rhodesian accent from Duff Gifford. Now, Duff Gifford was one of our Special Forces operators in Rhodesia. He was a member of my father's Tracker Combat Unit and the Selous Scouts. But he was also the first Zimbabwean back in 1984 who was brought with a team of 6 Zimbabweans to America for training in holistic management. So we know for a fact that Duff sat for 2 months educating Leonardo DiCaprio on the vital role of livestock in ecosystem restoration. So why does DiCaprio now say support laboratory raised meat and veganism and all these nutcases? Quite simply because his ego will not allow him to go against the perceived will of his followers and his fan base. It's his fear of being ridiculed by his fans that prevents him morally standing up and saying what he knows to be correct, true, and right. And that's why I'm saying it's instinctual fear that is going to destroy us. And it comes in many forms. Another one is Branson.
Thanks for once again reiterating the problem. I asked you for the solution, not the problem.
Well, I'm not smart enough to know how we overcome what has made us successful as humans. That's why I put it out here in my talks, hoping that someone else will figure out how we can overcome instinctual fear.
Yeah, Tim Smith, how do you stage your holistic methods on land that the actual operator has 25% control of the management plan on that? We have many people here today and throughout the West that basically are subordinate to the government agencies creating the management plan. Seems to me like those people need to be at the forefront of the education system towards holistic management.
Tim, it's actually very easy, and it's this creation of this holistic context. In it, whoever has veto power over your decisions has to be involved in creating your context with you. So we've got a lot of properties in the West who brought their BLM agents, their Bureau of Indian Affairs agents, their forestry agents into their family properties to help create their contexts together. And like with my war veterans, there was a lot of conflict originally, but a lot of those properties have got incredible social capital with those organizations today. I would say that Zinke's new outcomes-based management is a direct result of 30 years of holistic managers working with their individual agents to come together to create that context, to whereby when you now make a decision, and you need to make a decision that goes against the government regulations, because the government helped create the context and you all want the same thing, the government agents have been successful in finding ways around their own regulations to help their farmers because they've all bought into the same context. And I'll give the simple example. Many of the holistic managers who've gone through this, the government agents have had to write stuff up in the form of research because research can get approval. And so that's the way the government agents have assisted the farmers or ranchers that they've been working with. But conflict has never solved any problem. Deciding how we want our lives to be generally does. And I don't know of any rancher who wants any animal to go extinct. So when we get people working together and everyone realizes that we all want the same thing, well, then it's more important to figure out, well, how do we get there? How do we navigate the regulations? How do we do that? And people have been really successful at figuring out ways forward. But I would encourage anyone to learn how to create a context with bringing everyone in together. And it's very uncomfortable. I will admit it's very uncomfortable when you first start doing it. But you do get there.
Hi, I'm Betsy Gaines, and I'm from Bozeman, Montana. And the first question I have is it Alan Savory, your father?
He's my kid brother.
Your brother? Okay, I've never met him.
His father.
I'm somewhat familiar with his methodology. And I have a question. I know that this model has come from Africa, which is in areas that are migratory with species, large herbivores. And I'm wondering, is this model applicable to areas that don't have traditional migratory patterns of big herbivores? And are you suggesting that by nutrient loading with livestock that you can change ecosystems to be more accommodating to large herds? And what are the environmental implications of that? And my last thing is, what do you think is going to happen now that Mugabe's stepped down?
Jeez, that's this is bear hunting here. Betsy, let me start by telling you that holistic management is just a decision-making framework. That's all it is. And it's a decision-making framework towards your quality of life. So all those other questions you have to answer within your quality of life. Now, I will say categorically that holistic management as we practice it in Africa is the equivalent of eating with a knife and fork, and holistic management as it's practiced in America is the equivalent of eating with chopsticks. They are both utensils, but they're very different. Now, why I say that is because how the knowledge was transferred, the message we were trying to give coming from Africa was not heard here. And so, as you know, your questions about the migratory animals, well, you had migratory animals here. You had bison herds that migrated from Mexico up to Canada. Whether it was a brittle or non-brittle environment, well, your migratory herds were only in your non-brittle environments. They weren't in the forests back east. All of those kind of questions kind of get answered automatically. So I appear like I'm sidestepping your question, but I don't want to dig down into it, because when you're actually trying to create your context and make your decisions, you actually get to the answers you're looking for. As far as Mugabe, the guy who's taken over through the coup, his nickname in the country is the crocodile, and he is a crocodile. So I'm not hopeful for the future.
You have a quick question?
I should know better. John Rewarding, Modesto, California. The three principles we have under sustainability are currently economically viable, ecologically sound, and socially workable. It sounds to me like the fourth principle there, the one we keep coming to under sustainability, should be preserves individual liberty and freedom. Because left to our own devices, individual rangeland operators will practice the most productive set of practices possible, or they will be selling their ranch and grazing rights to people who will practice the most productive practices possible. So it seems like property rights and individual freedom are core to sustainability.
John, I would like to think that, but history has not proven that correct. The model of the last 10,000 years was mine and move on. But we're now at a place in the planet's history where population growth has met up with that, and since the invention of the atomic bomb, the ability for a nation to go and invade other people's land and conquer them and take over has been removed, because the consequences of that battle are now horrendous. So for the first time in human history, we actually have to stick with what we've got and fix what we've got. But history doesn't bear out what you're saying. But in an ideal world going forward, the work that was done in China at at the barrel of a gun, granted, by the Chinese Communist Party on the Lost Plateau, where they've healed a piece of land bigger than France and Belgium combined, started with the Chinese Communist government giving their peasants title deeds to their land. And so there is a strong argument for property rights going forward, but historically that wasn't the case. But yes, I would agree that liberty and property rights are very important.
Rodger will be here all day. Thank you, Rodger Savory. Once again, a round of applause.